Welcome to City Inside Out, where you get news, information, and opinion about important topics on Seattle's agenda. Today we go in depth with the following question: is it worth it to spend millions, even perhaps billions, to restore and protect creeks within the city? A new citizen initiative seeks to do just that. We discuss it, first with Councilmember Margaret Pagler, a skeptic, and later with one of its sponsors. Before that, however, a review of the news. Greg Nichols, Ron Sims, and other Sound Transit leaders stood proud this week to report that light rail is now a train to somewhere, namely to the airport. The most recent plan had the transit project stopping somewhat short of SeaTac because of budget constraints. The announcement means that light rail will now quite literally go the extra mile.
One of the pieces of that promise that was made in 1996 and voted on by the people of King, Pierce, and Snohomish County was that this system would get to the airport. And for the last year or two, as we've described the initial segment, which we're going to break ground on very soon, we have had to say it goes from downtown Seattle almost to the airport. Well, today we can say we know how it's going to get to the airport. We have our marching orders in getting into that important regional destination.
Where did Sound Transit suddenly get the money for the airport extension, something it couldn't fund before? Well, the agency says it will continue collecting its taxes through 2011 instead of 2009. Critics voiced doubts about whether this announcement can restore light rail's diminished credibility with the public. And speaking of rail transit, here's a clever headline from the Seattle Times this week. Quote, Mayor Nichols names desire a streetcar to South Lake Union. That's right, a streetcar. The mayor this week proposed adding yet another transportation option on top of water taxis, buses, monorails, and light rails. A circulator streetcar from Westlake Center to South Lake Union would, the mayor argues, serve big employers, including many biotech companies that billionaire Paul Allen is luring to that part of town.
The South Lake Union neighborhood provides some incredible opportunities for our city, an opportunity to create perhaps 20,000 or more new jobs. And because of its proximity to the University of Washington, institutions like the Fred Hutch have located there, and the additional jobs, in large part, will be in those high-tech and biomedical industries. So it gives us a chance to create jobs, and we need to find a way to connect that neighborhood to our downtown. A streetcar historically connected that neighborhood, and we think that that would be a good solution for the future as well.
The monorail continues to move fast, perhaps a little too fast, says Margaret Pagler. The council's most notable monorail skeptic this week warned that there are many policy hurdles that the city will need to clear as the monorail goes forward. It's not quite as simple as merely building the thing. Planners of the new Green Line, she warned, need to consider existing city policies before they get too aggressive with their timelines and deadlines.
There may well be things that the City Council needs to do with under our general authority, and presumably we need to amend our comprehensive plan, amend our neighborhood plans, and possibly develop our own design review guidelines. I mean, I think that there are other kinds of considerations that the City Council will need to address in light of the passage of the monorail initiative.
One more transportation item to report. After much study and debate, the state this week sided with those who want to open HOV lanes during non-peak hours. The new rules will allow single occupancy vehicles to use the lanes between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. For now, the only roadways scheduled for this change are on the east side, not in the city limits of Seattle. A citizen initiative to restore and protect creeks in Seattle is out collecting the last few hundred remaining signatures it needs to qualify for the fall ballot. It would mandate that the city spend millions, even billions by one estimate, for creek work. The council has a couple of options about how to react to this measure, including submitting an alternative of its own for the ballot. We'll take up the question of creek restoration later in our program today. Here's a new one, eco-friendly cement. And you thought you had heard it all, eh? Well, Heidi Wills this week announced that Seattle's new City Hall is being built with environmentally sensitive cement. Turns out there is a new way of creating blended cement that uses industrial waste products, including ash, instead of raw materials. It's more than just the reuse of these products that's good for the environment. The major benefit is not needing to process the raw materials traditionally used in cement. That process generates large amounts of greenhouse gases that cause global warming. The mayor recently added 2 names to his cabinet. First, he has nominated Katie Hong, a former staffer to Governor Gary Locke, to be his director of housing. Second, Diane Sugamura is his choice to be the new director of DCLU, the department responsible for construction and permitting review. We now turn to our neighborhood roundup. Here's some of what's making news in communities across the city, starting with Beacon Hill. The roving tent city will make a return appearance to that neighborhood next week. About 100 homeless men and women are expected to camp out on the grounds of El Centro de la Raza, the Latino community center there. Seattle rules prohibit Tent City from staying longer than 3 months in any one place. And speaking of El Centro, the agency recently marked its 30th year serving the community. From the beginning, it has been led by Roberto Maestas, who continues to head the organization. Uptown now to Magnolia, where it was announced that a new farmers market will open this summer. It will sell fresh fruit and vegetables. This will bring to 5 the number of active farmers markets in Seattle. The others, the U District, Columbia City, West Seattle, and Lake City. And here's something for people all over town. Neighborhood Appreciation Day is coming up on Saturday, February 8th. Neighborhoods are encouraged to organize block parties, potlucks, and gatherings to recognize and encourage caring neighbors. You can even send a special Neighborhood Appreciation Day greeting card, which are now available free at any of the 13 neighborhood service centers around Seattle. And now on to our City Inside Out calendar. Here are some events and happenings of interest this week in Seattle. The monorail continues its active outreach to get citizen input into the design and route of the plan. The next 3 meetings are as follows: Queen Anne, next Tuesday, the 28th, SoDo, Wednesday, the 29th, and Inner Bay, Thursday, January 30th. 2 park meetings to announce. Both seek input from citizens about design alternatives. The Flow Ware Park Improvement Project in the Central District will be discussed on Tuesday, the 28th. And updates to the Kubota Garden in the South End will be discussed on Thursday, January 30th. Finally, if you are worried about how to reduce the risk of landslides in and around your home, the city wants to help. 2 public meetings, 1 in each end of town, are scheduled to offer information. The first is Saturday the 25th at North Seattle Community College. The second is Saturday the 1st at South Seattle Community College. If you would like more information about any of these events, you can always log on to our website at www.seattlechannel.org. And finally today, our topic of in-depth this day is creek restoration. Is this a good use of city money? Margaret Pager joins us, and later co-chair of the citizen initiative that would mandate much new spending on this environmental issue. Stay with us. City Inside Out returns in a moment. We now welcome Margaret Pager to our program. She is chair of the Water and Health Committee of the Seattle City Council. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Let me just ask you, what are the condition of Seattle's creeks? Good, bad?
I think we've got good creeks in good condition and creeks that aren't in such good condition. We've really emphasized over the last half dozen years restoring creeks in the city. For the millennium, Mayor Schell wanted to celebrate trees, water, and light. And the water aspect of that celebration was a major new set of investments in our urban creeks, the Millennium Creeks Project. So 4 of our creeks were substantially restored.
And when you say restore, what does that entail?
Restoring creeks usually entails going into the creek and sometimes putting in gravel beds, putting in logs that create sort of steps in the creek so that it flows more smoothly on a gradient. Often you've got to go in and you've got to take out the old tires and the old plastic
garbage in
bottles
there.
and all
Yeah.
the garbage,
Yeah.
clean that all away, dig out the invasive species, and you get work crews often from the neighborhood and citizen activists that will take out ivy and blackberries, plant native plants, watch those plantings for a couple of years.
How much does it include daylighting? And by daylighting, we mean, as I understand it, literally taking creeks that are underground in pipes, for whatever reason, and literally bringing them back to the open surface.
From time to time, we've daylighted portions of creeks where it seemed to make sense. One of the things that's happened over the century that we've had urban development here is sometimes those pipes that carry some of the water that used to go into the creeks have been rerouted, or they're put down at a different level. I know when we had the project to put the police headquarters or police precinct in West Seattle, where the Kmart is located, there's a stretch of Longfellow Creek that used to go under that huge lot, and it's now in a pipe. But as it turns out, that pipe is 40 feet below the surface of the ground, so trying to recreate an open creek on that site would be just next to impossible.
Initiative 80, which is a citizen initiative to the council, they expect to get enough signatures that it'll require action, and you either have to accept it or put it on the ballot with an alternative, among other things. It would require, as I understand it, property owners doing major developments. We're not talking about just a single family home, but property owners doing major developments, Northgate or U Village, those kind of things.
Or Kmart.
That are on top of culverted creeks, as say creeks that for a reason were put underground years ago, to daylight them. Is that unnecessarily burdensome to a developer? And what does that cost to a developer?
Well, I don't know. That's something that they would certainly go to the courts about. But as city government has looked at some of those opportunities, for example, at Ravenna Creek, we found that there's no way to engineer that little stretch so that it really becomes a natural creek again. And if you could do it, if you could figure out how to do the engineering, then you ask yourself, well, what's the environmental value? Would it really increase the value of that land for salmon? And a couple of years ago, in '99, when the federal government said that Chinook salmon were an endangered species, we began to refocus our energies around, what can we really do to save Chinook salmon and other threatened species. And there just really are better ways to invest.
And let me get in those better ways, but let me just stay in this for a second. Northgate, let's just look at Northgate. Thornton Creek, which goes under there, has for years. The property developers at Northgate, under Initiative 80, would be required to daylight that if they do anything other than keep it as a parking lot. If it gets triggered when you start doing a major development. How much will that cost, or put in this way, do you think that would be a deterrent to a development up there? I mean, is someone going to not develop or even want to own Northgate property under an initiative like this?
Well, we already know that. We already know that the owner of the mall is trying to sell that property and can't get a buyer, precisely because nobody wants to undertake the cost of trying to turn that into a creek again. And I don't know that it should be turned into a creek again. If you really want to restore the natural condition, you would make it all a bog, because that was a bog. If there was anything like a creek, there was a drainage ditch that drained the bog. And restoring things to pre-urban condition, sort of, where do you stop?
Let me allow you then to talk about the science of it. How many creeks in Seattle are used by salmon to spawn, and is that an important part of the science?
Most of the salmon that we're concerned about, the different salmon runs, really need cold water. They need cold water creeks that flow year-round and have a certain water level in the winter. Chinook, like main stem rivers, they're not interested in our little urban creeks, as they're not a good environment for them. And we get some returns of chum and coho off the coast. But Most of the salmon runs that we're most concerned about restoring are runs that go down, either down the Green Duwamish River or the Cedar River. And so our effort in Seattle, if we care about restoring salmon, needs to be on the shorelines from the locks through Lake Washington to the Cedar River or to the Green River, or through the Duwamish down to the Green River.
We have a map here that you brought in that shows kind of all the watersheds and how they patch up here to make this quilt. As we look at that, let me ask you, then your emphasis would be on things like the Cedar River, the Duwamish, the big corridors which salmon are using, and shorelines, I mean sort of the routes the salmon get there. In other words, if you put all the money in the world into urban creeks, are you here to say you would make a marginal difference in these salmon runs as opposed to the other rivers in the area?
Well, if we put all of our money into urban creeks in Seattle's urban creeks, I don't think we'd make any difference to the Chinook runs.
We have your graphic up here.
Great. If you look at the area that's labeled 9, that's the Green Duwamish watershed. That's an area where 2 counties and I think like 20 cities are working together on a plan to save salmon in that watershed. That comes right through the Duwamish. That's where the fish make the adjustment between salt and freshwater. And the city of Seattle is spending a lot of money and making a lot of projects to improve the habitat, even though that's a really industrialized area in the lower Duwamish, to improve the habitat for salmon. And
that'll get more bang for your buck, you argue?
Absolutely. Now we've put some money into Ham Creek and some of those other creeks that flow down into the Duwamish, but the real energy needs to be on making sure that estuary has refuge areas for emerging fish. And similarly, the area that I think is colored blue on the map and labeled 8, that's the Cedar watershed. It includes Lake Washington and the locks, and there's a light green right to the east of that, which is Sammamish. That's all part of the same watershed. We've got 2 counties and I think 30 cities that are collaborating on plans to make it possible and successful for salmon to come through that watershed. But one of the things we've identified as a real problem is the Lake Washington shoreline areas. Now, for my money, I really want to work with Lake Washington property owners to see if we can get voluntary change from riprap.
Because briefly, what do they do? What would be a good alternative for them?
I think that sort of the typical shoreline, or many of the shorelines along Lake Washington, have this heavy-duty riprap, big rocks.
I mean, bulkhead-like.
Bulkheads, and then docks and piers. One tactic is to make the docks and piers more so the light can come through them, and so they're transparent in various ways. Another thing that is important for juvenile salmon is to take out the bulkheads and replace them with more natural sloping shoreline,
which would help.
Which would help juvenile salmon.
I got to close here in a second. Is it true, though, that this I-80 is pushing the city to at least look at more alternatives for raising money to help creek restoration?
Oh, I'm concerned about the financial impacts in the initiative.
Right, now I don't have time to get into those, but I just want to say, is it pushing the city? I mean, the mayor has now agreed, yeah, we need to raise more money for creek restorations in the city. Do you agree that it is time to at least put some more money into it?
I don't know that we need to put more money into it. When I look at the roll-up of all the money that we've put into salmon restoration and into creeks over the last couple of years, and we're at $4 to $7 million a year on creek restoration, I think that's about the level of expenditure that we can reasonably afford.
I got to go here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Margaret Pagler. Up next, a member of Yes for Seattle talking about a new initiative to help save and restore creeks in the city in a moment. We now welcome Noel Lowney. He is co-chair of Yes for Seattle, the group pushing the new Major Creeks Restoration Initiative by the number 80. Briefly describe what this initiative is and what it would do.
Okay. Thank you. Well, a lot of people in Seattle don't understand what an incredible resource we have here with our creeks. We have 5 creeks systems in the city of Seattle that have salmon in them. And the creek systems also are an incredible open space resource and habitat for birds and other animals. So we've developed Initiative 80, which will restore Seattle creeks and move us towards restoring our salmon habitat and other habitat in the city. It does a number of things. Most importantly, it sets out a vision for how we're going to move forward on salmon recovery by adopting strong policies and requiring planning for creek restoration in the city. It also requires the city to do certain things, like stop using pesticides within 200 feet of the creeks, because those pesticides, they go down, they pollute not only the creeks, but also Puget Sound. And also accelerates the city's ongoing restoration efforts on city properties. Probably one of the most important things that Initiative 80 does is it brings developers, major developers, into the creek restoration effort. And it says that when a developer is doing a major creekside development, they have to have restoration as part of the plan. And so they have to participate in restoration.
Let me ask you about that part of it, because we talked a little about Margaret Pagler on this front, Northgate. What would it require, your initiative, of a developer of Northgate, the south parking lot, which is currently undeveloped?
Well, we believe that Initiative 80, once it's passed, will create the impetus for a public-private partnership at Northgate that will ultimately daylight the creek. And this was Sierra Club's one of their national focuses, where they said this is an example of what we should do to create smart growth and livable communities. It will create public money to make it available so that the city can partner with whatever developer buys that property, so that we can make sure that we have transit-focused development right next to living environment.
What about the claim that if you daylight Thornton Creek, which is the creek up there, you don't materially do anything for salmon in the city?
Well, we don't believe that that's true. A couple things. One is that there aren't a lot of salmon up at Northgate right now because there are fish passage barriers downstream. And at some point in the future, the city has said that they're going to remove those fish passage barriers, allowing salmon to get up there. It's not going to be a huge amount of salmon that will be at Northgate because it's high up in the creek system. It's towards the headwaters. But it's critically important to do restoration on that part of the creek because the stormwater problems that are caused by Northgate in particular, all the water rushing down during the rain, is having a dramatic negative impact on the salmon downstream.
And why does daylighting affect that runoff?
Well, right now, the creek is in a pipe. So when it rains, there's no place for the water to go except shooting down. And our scientists that we've worked with said that that's a major threat for actually creating extinction of salmon within Thornton Creek. When you create a daylighting situation, during flood events, the water can go into the ground, and also there's room for it to flow. So it's got flood retention capabilities. That protects downstream habitat. It also protects downstream properties, because right now downstream properties are being eroded and people are losing their yards and homes. When
you're talking about daylighting creeks and the requirement to daylight under your initiative, it's for major developments. A thing like Northgate, it's got to be a multifamily, building or a big commercial development. So you're not talking about just a single family home.
That's right. There's a great example of that right now in that the city of Kirkland just required Northwest College to do a daylighting project because Northwest College is doing a major expansion of its college, and they said, okay, do a daylighting as a requirement of 200 feet of the creek that's on their property.
So there's some precedent for this. But why would you burden a developer? Let's say Northgate, U Village, the others that would fit into this. Why burden a developer with daylighting a creek that they had nothing to do with putting underground in the first place? It was put there years ago to help allow the city to grow and be dense. Is it fair to a developer to make them do that?
Well, we think it is fair. It's just as fair as it is to require a developer to build a sidewalk, for example. And in the case of Northgate,
It's
in
a
fact,
lot different in terms of money.
not necessarily, because most of the types of restoration that developers will have to do under the initiative are about the same cost as the landscaping that they already do. If they're doing a major development, millions of dollars, we think that it's appropriate for them to contribute to a restoration project. If it's a really expensive restoration project, the city, under the initiative, will have money to be able to contribute to that project because we set up an account to do that. And we cap the public costs at $5 per household per year, which is about 40 cents a month per household.
How much in Northgate, just to stick with this idea because it's an example of how it would affect the rest of development in Seattle, how much of the 10 acres there at Northgate would have to be set aside if they are required to daylight that creek?
Well, it's about 12 acres that's available right now, and we think that the daylighting can occur in about 3 acres. Now, what's interesting is that Mayor Nichols has already proposed to acquire 3 acres on that site to do public retention, stormwater detention, except rather than using that 3 acres in a linear fashion to daylight the creek, the mayor has proposed to buy a square block. And so we're saying you've got the same amount of property needs. Let's actually get this creek daylighted. And I would also say that in that case, Northgate did put the creek into the pipe many years ago.
But certainly the current owner didn't, or anyone who's going to...
Their successors.
But are you saying then that this new developer at Northgate wouldn't be required to daylight the creek because the city's going to already do it under the plan that Nichols...
No, what we're saying is that under Initiative 80, a major developer like that, and that's a $100 million project, would be required to daylight the creek. But it will be a public-private partnership.
So they wouldn't bear the whole cost you're
here to say. They wouldn't bear all the costs.
What about Margaret Pageler's discussion about shorelines? The best thing to do for salmon is shorelines, both through the locks in the lake around Elliott Bay. Your thoughts?
My thoughts are we hope that she will continue to hold that position when it's time to update the city's shoreline master program. You see, the shorelines in the city are already governed by the city's shoreline master program and the Shoreline Management Act on the state level, but the creeks aren't. So we've got laws that protect these other parts and require restoration of the areas of property that Councilmember Pageler was talking about. But our creeks are in limbo land. And what's happening is that they are on a decline. And we have a choice about allowing that decline to continue or turning it around. And what we've heard from citizens is that they think it's time for us to try and take the step to be leaders in this salmon recovery effort and to make sure we have open space in our communities by restoring creeks.
Just a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
There are some big headlines about how much your initiative would cost, millions, even billions of dollars. You're here to say how much per year.
Well, we cap the public costs at $5 per household per year, which is 40 cents a month per household. People have told us that they think that that's reasonable. Now, SPU has come out saying it will cost $26 billion. There's plenty of flaws. If people want to see the flaws, they should look at our website, yesforseattle.org. But what's interesting is that they acknowledged the spending caps, and they said that in order to spend that amount of money, the initiative would have to work for 4,000 years.
For $5 a year per household, you raise about $1.2 million to $1.3 million.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's right.
As you said, your website is yesforseattle.org
Yes.
if you want more information. And Margaret Pageler lets us know that if you want more information about her plan and what the city's doing, you can go to seattle.gov/salmon and among other things, get this brochure. Noel Lowney, co-chair of Yes for Seattle, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
And we thank you all for being here. To those who want to check more information about our program, you can check seattlechannel.org. And with that, we close on behalf of our talented studio crew here at the program. I'm C.R. Douglas. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.